Hey everyone, I'm responding to a PragerU video titled A Short History of Slavery. Before I get started, I want people to be aware that the video has truths within it, and don't be afraid to concede that, especially if you despise PragerU. The problem isn't the truths, it's the omitting of information that counters the narrative they are trying to create. There will be plenty of examples throughout the video. Now with that out of the way, let's listen to some Candace Owens.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner.
Wow, 36 seconds in and you can already see what kind of narrative they are trying to weave. If this was an objective, short history of slavery, it wouldn't have started off so defensive, as if it's trying to deflect criticism against white people. It's true that slavery has been around since ancient times, there's no denying that. Whenever you have a hierarchical social structure, some form of slavery can develop from that under the right conditions. Even in Western Europe, when Muslim men and women were transported there between the Renaissance and Enlightenment era to be slaves. While slavery is barbaric, the incentive behind it is economic gain. You don't have to pay these people a living wage, otherwise it defeats the purpose of high productivity with little cost. I doubt the video will touch on this or Europe having slaves because it's a defensive video on the behalf of white people. Its opening statement was, slavery wasn't invented by white people, leading up to, they saw the natives do it. I also found it weird how she framed the meeting of Columbus and the Taino people as the explorers arrived and the Taino seeking help from their aggressive and occasionally cannibalistic neighbors, making no mention of Columbus kidnapping many of them to be sold to Spain, which made way for further expeditions there for slave labor, resulting in their population being greatly diminished. But she can't mention that part, it will interfere with the narrative. Back to Candace.
Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries.
Notice how she's making a big emphasis on white people when it comes to Muslim people enslaving Eastern Europeans, but when it came time to mention slavery in Europe, it was such a passing mention. She even got that part wrong in an attempt to minimize slavery in Europe. When she says there was slavery in most of Europe between the 1st and 5th centuries, she's referring to part of the early Middle Ages timeline, when oftentimes the losing side would get their people captured and enslaved by the victor. However, slavery existed beyond that. As more Europeans began converting to Christianity, that began unifying the Europeans under a single religious identity. With that identity, the sentiment of who should be enslaved shifted to those who were not Christian. And Europeans still agreed with slavery, they just searched outwards for people to be enslaved. European slavery existed way beyond your 1st and 5th century timeline, which I have to call into question because slaves existed in Europe up until the gradual shift to non-Christian slaves. Central and Western European empires saw an economic boom while doing this, and to point back to Columbus again, that took place in the 1490s. When he met the Taino people, he wrote in his diary that they would easily be made Christians because it seemed to me they had no religion. And yes, it would be by force. This is an example of how Europeans used religion to guide or justify their actions. Europeans participating in a transatlantic slave trade to send slaves to the Americas still meant they practiced slavery. It doesn't have to be in their home continent to be considered slavery. They just outsourced it. When you mention Muslims enslaving Eastern Europeans, the Christians were enslaving the Muslims as well, with the hopes of converting them over time. Does the Christian Crusades ring a bell? I personally think what the Muslims did was messed up, but your framing of the video in defense of a certain group over others is really sad. If you want to talk about the history of slavery, please don't be so one-sided about it. Yes, some aspects of human history sucks and it hurts, but omitting parts you don't like to spin a narrative, whether good or bad, causes the most harm. She goes on to talk about how common slavery was in the ancient world and seconds after that about slavery in Africa via the Egyptians. I don't disagree with that, so I'll skip that part.
Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice.
Oh no, if it wasn't apparent moments ago, it should be now. Notice how she completely omitted slavery in America to immediately jump to white men leading the world into ending slavery. This video's propaganda is oozing out of the screen. By the way, Haiti was the first nation to ban slavery in 1804, not Britain. While doing so served as inspiration for the French to abolish theirs. If this video wasn't so apparent in its bias, I'd excuse this error and say, be careful next time. But because it's an extreme case of whataboutism, this doesn't look good for Candace, and especially PragerU. A video about the history of slavery implies some form of objectivity, but no, this video is some weird way of painting white people in a better light than anyone else. That millions of white people were captured and enslaved by Muslims, but not the other way around. Don't mention that part, it will ruin the narrative. These European nations eventually made slavery illegal, which is true, but it does a great disservice of telling the history of slavery by omitting information to make European nations banning it seem like an inherent moral act instead of how it actually was. A messy, morally confusing time leading up to its eventual outlawing. That's the reason why abolitionist movements existed in Europe and the United States. This video fails to mention that because it's so one-sided in its messaging.
Includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War. Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless.
That last bit would be great if the video itself actually reflected that. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
All white, by the way.
Calm down, Candace. That had nothing to do with race. Anyways, this video up until this point was more focused on non-Europeans committing slavery and how white men led the world to ending it. If you say no one stands guiltless, then share the history more objectively. Let the history speak for itself. You want to talk about things being complicated, but scared to talk about the details. You briefly mentioned the Civil War, and the only part you mentioned were the 300,000 white Union soldiers dying to end the war, and that's it. Yes, just mention that white people died in the Civil War and leave it up to your viewers' imagination, because if you had said anything more, your narrative would have crumbled. While it's clear that the South fought to preserve slavery, the North is a bit complicated. It wasn't as simple as they fought for the slaves' freedom, and from what I've gathered, the motivations were varied. There were anti-slavery sentiments in the northern states, but it wasn't because they actually cared about black people who were enslaved. Black people in the northern states were still seen as inferior to the white people there, so that only leaves economic conflict as the reason why northerners opposed slavery. If you want your white people who oppose slavery, if that's what matters to you, you could have talked about the radical sect of Republicans during that time. Not only did they oppose slavery, they wanted equal treatment for them afterwards. Of course, the history is deeper and richer than that, and it's not something I want to get into with a video of this format.
Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few. Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon.
Who's saying that? Give examples, please, other than the weird tweets from Twitter and fringe online subgroups. You'll be hard-pressed to find people outside of those groups who can't acknowledge the messy history of the human race. Your crutch for this entire video is weak. Let's say your reasoning for making this video is true, that people overwhelmingly paint slavery as a white phenomenon. The solution isn't to go the complete opposite and point out the flaws of non-white people. The solution is to say slavery is a human problem. It's an unfortunate part of the human condition, and at times our tribal inclinations get the better of us. but it's also part of the human condition to rise above that. It's too bad your video doesn't reflect the latter.
And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. It's a fantasy.
This is a very weak foundation to place this video on. So because people say we are kings and queens on social media, you think that justifies the making of this video in such a heavily biased way? Once again, your go-to example is social media, where you can find all kinds of crazy people. In these times, you can find people saying anything on social media. This PragerU video is fighting misinformation with half-truths. To be fair, there were Africans in high places, for example, the sultans of the Mali Empire, but it wasn't some paradise nation and obviously deserves a video of its own. Also, way to downplay Europeans' involvement in Africa's decline. Africa wasn't perfect before European colonization, but it's the colonization that played a role in the destabilization in the continent. In the next part of the video, it obviously goes into Africans participating in the slave trade by selling African slaves to Europeans for cheap items. But I have to play some of it so you can see how she omits information to keep a narrative going.
The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors.
Wow, that's disgusting. That's what you do with the information? Our lives had little value to our ancestors? How about slavery is bad, period? It's true, Africa had and still has slavery of many forms. Before the transatlantic slave trade, slavery in West and Central Africa was done so for similar reasons in Europe and Southwest Asia: labor needs, to spread power, economic gain, or to convert someone's spiritual beliefs. However, you will find many small African kinship societies who opposed slavery. Africa as a whole didn't support slavery in unison. That's such a simplistic way of looking at it. When the transatlantic slave trade began in full force, it basically pressured African societies to increase the amount of people they enslaved to meet the increased demand. Also, those who were slaves in Africa had a chance to become free within their lifetime and weren't always separated from their families. So they thought perhaps it would be the same wherever the Europeans were taking them. We all know it wasn't. Let me reiterate that slavery is bad even when non-white people are doing it. The point of bringing this up is because it wasn't as simple as white people showing up and Africans in unison rounding up other Africans for cheap products. Your video does a grave disservice to the history of that region because your main concern is to defend white people from what you see on social media. I know my explanation isn't thorough because this isn't the right video for it, but Candace's video is made to be an opinion piece masquerading as a history video. She continues to talk about slavery still existing in Africa, which I don't disagree with, but it's sad how she's using that information.
That's the lowest estimate that I could find. Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States.
See? There's more slaves than what was brought into the United States, so it's worse than what white people did. There isn't anything more I can say that I haven't said already. I wanted to play that clip to let you know that, yeah, she goes there with that information.
African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries.
That's right, Candace, you protect those white men. They didn't do nothing. What happened to no one, regardless of skin color, is without guilt? Why frame this in such a biased way? Also, last time I checked, Russians are considered white because many of them originated from Europe, and slavery exists there today within the poorer and less regulated regions. I know, Candace says traditional definition of slavery, but she doesn't state what that definition is. You would think that will help make her point, but I believe that's information left out purposefully so the PragerU audience can fill in the blanks themselves and attack dissenting opinions. If I'm being honest, I believe saying traditional definition is an attempt to narrow slavery down so it can only appear in non-white countries. Why else would she confidently say that? I'm not playing goofy definition games. You obviously don't care about the issue at hand, otherwise you would have done a better job at fact-checking. You're just doing this to spite people on social media.
Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago. Why? Because our so-called leaders, black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable.
Oh my gosh. This is what the video has been leading up to? I am absolutely certain now that this video was just meant to target black people and reaffirm the opinions of the PragerU audience. This is not a history video. Between the "we were kings" example and the black victimhood statement, it's clear now. She has some nerve to say people are profiting off a black victimhood mentality. She's profiting off a white victimhood mentality.
All white, by the way.
Yeah, I know. Gosh. I've had enough of this video. The next part is about American freedom and heritage anyways. It's a very nice way to end a video about the history of slavery. If this video was all the information you ever gotten about slavery, you'd walk away thinking slavery is largely a non-white thing. While white people did participate in it, it wasn't as large as non-white slavery. White people were the ones who legally banned it based on their core values. Anyone disputing that probably think they was kings and queens, not knowing that their ancestors sold them for bottles and mirrors. And you, black person watching this, be proud of your American heritage, which made you the free person that you are. How sad is that? Using half-truths and omitted information to spin a weird message. The video was messy because it wasn't about the history. The topic of slavery was a jumping point for that message towards the end. And people should be rightfully upset with the video. The bias was clear as soon as Candace spoke, and objectivity was nowhere to be found. The only good thing I could say about the video is the infographic art. It's nicely presented, but that's about it. I'm very afraid to see what else PragerU has in store. It depends on how I feel because I'm subjecting myself to right-wing propaganda videos. Who knows? If you want to keep the channel going or help fund my upcoming series, you can become a patron. The link is down below and any amount is greatly appreciated. Anyways, I gotta go. Be nice to one another and take care of yourselves.